So many of us are very familiar with some of the organization structures utilized during the Clone Wars, but one that I don't see talked about very often is the organization structure utilized by the Republic Navy. So I figured today we could take a closer look at exactly how the Republic's Navy was organized and how it was utilized in the conflict. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So during the Clone Wars, the Republic fielded the largest naval force it had ever utilized in its history. This fleet of easily tens of thousands of Venator-class Star Destroyers, as well as a wide variety of smaller vessels, made up a very impressive naval force. But how exactly was this naval force organized and utilized during the conflict? Well, let's just jump right in with their fleet organization. The Republic Navy is broken up into 20 large fleets. These are known as central fleets, and these fleets are likely assigned to a sector army. And these sector armies are assigned to various sectors around the galaxy, with ultimately 6 of these fleets holding back in the core regions to protect the populated center of the Republic. Meanwhile, the remaining 14 of these central fleets operated primarily on the front lines, seeing very heavy fighting throughout the conflict. It's interesting to note with this fleet structure that ships that had seen a lot of combat were often cycled out of those 14 fleets that were engaged, back to the fleets guarding the core worlds to give them a break, while the core world ships, which had mostly sat out of the action, were cycled into combat. This allowed weary naval forces to sort of rest in between engagements without having to pull them out of the sort of battle lines entirely. And while that formed the core of the general overview of the Republic Navy, it clearly wasn't the only way it operated. We see the Republic carry out a lot of offensives during the Clone Wars. Ultimately, the war itself was a very defensive war for the CIS, and a very offensive war for the Republic, especially during the later half of the conflict. And these large sector fleets were not carrying out offensive operations for the most part. They were just sort of holding the line against separatist attacks. Instead, these offensive forces were carried out by task groups or battle groups formed from those fleets. These are what we often see on screen during the Clone Wars. For example, during the Second Battle of Geonosis, a very large task force was formed from components of several different sector fleets and then sent against the separatist defenses on Geonosis. It's often these task forces that are put directly under the command of Jedi generals, who would also command, obviously, the ground forces tied to those task forces. Another interesting thing to note about these task forces is that while they were mostly temporary, with most of the ships being returned to their sector fleets once the task force is no longer needed, several ships did remain permanently part of this sort of shifting task force structure. These ships were often considered to be part of the Open Circle Armada, a logo that we actually see a lot throughout the Clone Wars, especially on ships used by Jedi generals, since these ships were almost always part of these sort of cobbled together task forces. As for the ships being utilized in these fleets, there was a lot of obviously Venator-class Star Destroyers, which formed the core of these fleets. They provided a stable base for a large fighter wing, as well as a very effective gun platform for heavy turbolasers for ship-to-ship engagements and screening against incoming starfighters. But they weren't alone. Any fleet designed to carry out a planetary invasion likely had several Acclamator-class assault ships with them. These ships are specifically designed to carry out sort of landing operations, so they're perfect for this kind of sort of military campaign. And then these ships would be supported by, especially later in the war, several different types of smaller vessels, including Consular-class frigates, these are converted Consular-class cruisers, and the Architans-class light cruisers as well. Now that's the makeup of these task forces. When you look at the larger sector fleets, it's assumed that they're larger versions of these task forces, with a lot of Venators being supported by a few Acclamators and an indeterminate number of smaller support vessels like Architans and Consulars. But it's not known for sure. I don't believe we ever actually see one of these fleets on screen. In fact, during most major defensive battles of the war, if there's an anticipation of a separatist attack, a task force will be formed to carry out defensive roles. All in all, this seems like a very effective way of running a navy like the Republic Navy. It's kind of impressive that this design basically came out of nowhere. The Republic didn't have the infrastructure for a navy even a few months before the outbreak of the war. The Navy was only authorized to exist following the Military Creation Act during the events of Episode 2, right before the Battle of Geonosis. And this naval structure would continue beyond the end of the Republic. The Galactic Empire would carry out a fairly similar structure within their navy, and if you'd like to learn about the structure within the Galactic Empire's navy, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think this sort of fleet organization system makes sense. Does it make sense to constantly be rotating ships in and out of combat in between sort of frontline positions and these reserve forces? Does it make sense to really have this rigid structure that you're constantly breaking to form task forces and other offensive and defensive units, basically as they're needed? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, leave it down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.